factories. Now it is moving to your main streets. 30% of stores and malls are closing. I believe the Des Moines Mall may be one of the victims of the fact that Amazon is soaking up $20 billion in business every single year and paying zero in federal taxes. So if you think about the retraining of workers, unfortunately it's not just a manufacturing problem, it's migrating to other parts of the economy. Eventually we'll migrate to the 100,000 or so truck drivers here in the state. And the truckers have a very similar profile to the manufacturing workers, but they're even more predominantly male, 94% instead of 65%. Again, average age 49, average education, high school or 1 year of college.
So one of the criticisms of UBI is the fear that it will undermine the dignity of work. Joe Biden has made this argument, saying that individuals need a sense of purpose and often get that through a job. How do you respond to that criticism?
I could not agree more. Jobs are about much more than income. They're about structure, purpose, fulfillment, community, many of the things that make us feel valued day to day. The misconception that Joe might have and others might have is they fail to realize what $1,000 a month would mean throughout a community or a state. So let's say here in Iowa, you all get $1,000 a month in addition to your current income. Where does that money go? The money goes right back into your local businesses and organizations, to daycare expenses and car repairs you've been putting off and Little League signups. And every single one of those businesses then has to staff up and expand to meet more robust demand for their services. So instead of getting this money and everyone stays home, actually the money ends up creating, in your case, tens of thousands of new jobs right in your main streets. But it would also supercharge things like volunteerism, arts, culture, nurturing and caregiving, journalism to some extent actually, because you can imagine at least some of this money ends up supporting local journalistic efforts. So I could not agree more with the fact that we thrive on having fulfilling work. The question is, how can we create tens of thousands of fulfilling jobs for people here in Iowa? And I would suggest that the most direct and effective way to do that would be to put buying power into your hands so that your economy can actually reflect your needs and values every single day.
One thing you talk about is how that UBI is basically pro-woman, and that more women than men still provide caregiving at homes, and this is a way, in a way, to sort of give some nod to paying for that help. There certainly is the argument that caregiving, even in the sort of paid workforce, tends to be a very low-dollar occupation.
Yes.
Could that, though, be a disincentive for higher wages for people working in caregiving occupations?
If you look at the gender disparities, it goes beyond the fact that women do more of the parenting and caregiving work. Women get paid less even if they're on the job. And by the numbers, if you put $1,000 a month into people's hands, it goes further with people that are either making less money or have lower levels of savings. And unfortunately, those two things correspond to women in our society, even before you take into account the fact that women do the vast majority of the uncompensated and unrecognized work in our communities. And Carol, you probably heard me talk about my wife who's at home with our two boys, one of whom is autistic. Her work is valued at zero every single day. But I want to think bigger about women who suffer from domestic violence or harassment on the job. How many of those women would be able to improve their situations or leave if they weren't dependent upon the partner or the boss at the diner for their income to survive? This would be the most pro-woman, anti-exploitation, anti-harassment measure we have ever adopted as a society, because women would be able to improve their situations directly by simply leaving or saying, look, I don't need this job. I can go home and at least survive for a little while until I find a job that isn't going to harass me on a regular basis. But I want to take a step further and dig into what you said about the fact that right now a lot of the caregiving work is being done by women. It's very low paid work. It is. If you look at the people who are actually caregivers for the infirm, it's vast majority women. And these jobs are very, very difficult and have very, very high turnover. Some studies have said that the turnover rate is literally 100% a year. Because if you are taking care of the elderly and infirm, it's very, very demanding, both physically and emotionally. It's isolating. Even just moving someone to go to the bathroom several times a day actually is a great opportunity to hurt your back. And that's one of the reasons why these jobs are so high turnover. So the question is, how do you actually channel meaningful resources into the hands of caring for our seniors? And if you had a dividend of $1,000 a month that stacks on top of Social Security, you then can actually create much more sustainable jobs to take care of people as they age. Because right now, certain people can afford assisted living communities, and then there are more robust services. But for many others, they're going to be taken care of by family members who right now are obviously not compensated or recognized in any way for that. Or if they employ someone, it's going to end up being, frankly, a woman that is being exploited in the workforce in a very high turnover field.
The Democratic field in many ways on healthcare is kind of divided into a Medicare for all and a public option. You land on the Medicare for all side of that spectrum. I'd like you to walk through in detail how you pay for it.
To me, the confusion around how we pay for healthcare misses the central point, which is that we're already paying through the nose for our healthcare in so many ways. We pay for it through higher prices. We pay for it through the fact that millions of us can't change jobs because we're afraid to lose our health care. We pay for it because it's the #1 cause of bankruptcy for families. And we pay for it because it's much, much harder to start a business without having your health care being secure and provided for. It's one reason why new business formation rates are at multi-decade lows in 80% of the country, including right here in Iowa. It also misses the fact that we're spending 18% of our GDP, over $3.6 trillion on our health care right now, twice as much as other countries, to worse results. Now, how can this be possible? Part of it is that 30% of the $3.6 trillion we're spending is waste. But a lot of it is because our healthcare system is not actually designed to make us stronger and healthier. It's designed to maximize profits and revenues for the drug companies, the device companies, and the private insurance companies. The way we, quote unquote, pay for it is we actually start trying to align the incentives and the resources that are being put to work to actually be dedicated to patient care, which they are not right now. I had a friend who's a genius at numbers go through the numbers of, well, she did it independently. I didn't ask her. She just did it because it's her job. But she looked at the numbers in the healthcare industry, and she said she has never seen price gouging, profiteering, and the profitability levels that she saw in the drug companies, the device companies, and the private insurance companies. She said it's completely unsustainable. So that is what the American people sense instinctively. When's the last time an American got this news from their insurance company? Great news, your premiums have gone down. That has never happened to any American, ever, because their entire business model is just to ratchet the prices up year after year. It has reached an unsustainable point, and the American people understand that.
A lot of other candidates, maybe sitting in the same chair, have talked about needing to flip the incentives in healthcare, so it's about well care instead of, just treating you when
activity, yeah, revenue.
Activities, outputs. But we see little change year after year. How do you really flip those incentives?
Well, you try and find what has worked out there in the real world. And so I'm inspired by the success in the Cleveland Clinic, where they began paying their doctors and providers based upon essentially a market salary. And then what you saw is that those doctors prescribed fewer drugs, decided that fewer procedures were necessary. And this was not negative for patient health and outcomes. It was actually positive. And it saved money because it turns out if your incentives are not tied to level of activity, then you look at a patient and say, you know what, I think you might be able to go home and just have like a wellness regimen or see a physical therapist or do something that doesn't involve cutting you open and spending tens of thousands of dollars. We're human beings. We respond to structural incentives. If you're a physician and you get paid more based upon how many procedures you perform, then your natural inclination is to say, a lot of people seem to need a procedure around here. If you're getting compensated independent of that, then you use a clinical judgment set that might lead to better outcomes. So a lot of it's tied to compensation of doctors. There is another model that has worked, aside from the Cleveland Clinic. It's a capitation model, where you go to a hospital and say, okay, how many people do you serve? What are the average costs for serving people in your market? We're going to essentially have you have relatively constant revenue flows and compensation, and it's up to you to try and make the best possible use of that to make people stronger and healthier. So there are things we can do immediately at the margins. Healthcare is 18% of our economy, and one thing that I'm concerned about, and I think some of the other candidates are concerned about as well, is that you can't make wholesale changes to 18% of the economy without causing real disruption and pain in various communities. One number, as an example, there are about 660,000 Americans right now who work in private health insurance. So if you were to have a plan that says, hey, we're going to get rid of private health insurance in 100 days, then you're literally saying we're going to fire 660,000 Americans in several months. And you can have whatever feelings you have about private health insurance, but the 660,000 people who work in private health insurance are just everyday Americans who wake up and go to a job. They're certainly not witting participants in some, something that's negative for the American people. They're just people who live in Hartford or people who live wherever, and they just wake up and go to their job like any other. So you have to be judicious about the pace and scale of the changes you make. But I'm 100% confident that we have ample resources in the system because we have so much excess in the system right now.
Today you're rolling out a more detailed plan to rein in the cost of prescription drugs. Part of that, you say that if a company won't give a drug at a reasonable price, that you'd license that to another company to produce that drug.
You actually, the government itself would have a manufacturing facility and would forcibly license it directly.
What's sort of a reasonable amount for a drug company to make on a drug or as a profit level?
It wouldn't necessarily be tied to their profit level. It would be tied to what they're charging us relative to what they're charging customers in other countries. Because right now it's commonplace for a drug company to charge us 2, 3, 4 times more than they're charging citizens of other countries, despite the fact that in the vast majority of cases, the American taxpayer subsidized the development of these drugs, or at a minimum subsidized the FDA evaluation of the drugs that prepared them for market. So if they decide to gouge us relative to the price in other countries, then any reasonable American would look up and say, okay, there's something wrong about that. I'm not against companies being able to make a reasonable return on their businesses. I mean, I've run businesses myself, but the drug companies have taken it to an all-new extreme, and they need to have some kind of monetary incentive to keep their prices under control. They only respond to dollars and cents, essentially. If we stood outside the drug company and said, do the right thing, we could say that every day forever and it would have zero impact. But if you said, hey, this is going to impact your shareholder returns and shareholder value, then all of a sudden their behavior would change.
Because you haven't held public office, what could Americans expect from your leadership style for your president?
I am the last person who would say, I'm going to run the government like a business, because they're very, very different things. In a business, you can say, hey, we should do this, and then people more or less have to listen to you. In the government, it's much more analogous to what I've done as the founder and CEO of a national nonprofit, where you have hundreds or thousands of stakeholders, and you present a vision and galvanize energy and consensus around that vision. You try and help people see that it's in their own self-interest to go along with you in that direction. So that's much more the leadership that's required in DC. I would also say that my administration will be comprised of people that have very deep relationships on Capitol Hill. You can't have a team of outsiders come in and say, we're going to whip this place into shape. That would not work. Just like when President Obama came in '08, what's one of the first things he did? He tabbed Joe Biden as his VP because Joe had decades of relationships and experience on Capitol Hill. So I would be looking for the same sort of complementary know-how and relationships on my team. That gives you a sense of my leadership style. I'm also not someone who cares about taking credit. People have found me to be an exceptional team builder in this way because I just want people to perform and do great things. And if they do great things, I'll be the first person to give credit where it's due. I just want to get the job done. I don't really care about where I am on the letterhead.
To jump several steps ahead, if you're successful in that effort, do you have concerns as an observer now and looking forward about the judiciary and whether your plans could run into hurdles from the judges that President Trump has appointed?
It's a real problem for sure. And one of the things I would look at, and this is not necessarily to your question because you're talking about federal judges at every level, but we should move away from lifetime appointments at the Supreme Court and move to 18-year term limits. When the Constitution was written, people did not live as long as they do now, and people stepped down from the Supreme Court for any of a range of reasons. They didn't wait until they were at death's door, frankly. If you had 18-year term limits, it would depoliticize the system significantly because then people would look up and say, okay, you lose an election, you win an election, you get 2 appointments essentially, and it's not dependent upon the health or age of the judges. Literally right now you're looking up and saying, ooh, I'm going to appoint this judge who's in his late 40s. This means that he's going to be there for 30 years. That's not a modern way to run a society. You shouldn't be putting people in place and saying this person's going to be making decisions on our laws 30 years from now. 18 years is a plenty long period of time for them to be free of external influence. And then if you rotate them off semi-regularly, the political firestorm that ensues around each appointment would diminish. But I do want to try and, frankly, counteract or reverse many of the judicial appointments that President Trump has made over the last number of years.
When you were talking about drug companies, you said you just can't count on them to do the right thing. You talked a lot about human-centered capitalism.
Yes.
And want to measure things like improvement in childhood success rate or improvement in the marriage rate rather than looking at GDP. But how do you overcome just basic human greed?
Well, this is the fun part, Carl. So as president, it's going to be within my authority to go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, 100 years old, kind of old and out of date. We should modernize it to include things like our health and life expectancy, our mental health and freedom from substance abuse, our childhood success rates, clean air and clean water. The fact is right now GDP is at record highs, but also at record highs in the United States of America, stress, anxiety, depression, even suicides and drug overdoses. It has gotten so bad that our life expectancy has declined for 3 years in a row. The first time that's happened in 100 years. Last time it happened was the Spanish flu, a global pandemic that killed millions. So you have to ask yourself, if GDP is at record highs but your people are dying earlier, what are you going to listen to? And as president, it's going to be well within my authority to say, look, we're now going to modernize our economic measurements. I've actually talked to economists in the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they said to me, it's about time. They've been trying to modernize the measurements for years because they know that the current measurements don't work. It's not just GDP. Stock market prices correspond to the fortunes of the top 20% of Americans. The bottom 80% of Americans own 8% of stock market wealth, and the bottom 50% own essentially zero. So why do you care about a stock market that only corresponds to the top fifth of your people? Headline unemployment rate, which we get beaten over the head with all the time. They say, ooh, it's at this great 3.8% rate. It's really low. But what that obscures is the fact that our labor force participation rate is down to a multi-decade low, same levels as Costa Rica and El Salvador, that 94% of new jobs in this country are temp gig or contract jobs that don't have benefits, the fact that 40% of recent college graduates are doing a job that doesn't require a college degree, None of that appears in the headline unemployment rate. So Carol, you ask about how do you mitigate American greed. It's like a separate set of issues. Issue number one is how do you actually measure your society's progress? And one of the reasons I'm going to suggest that people in Iowa are getting increasingly distressed and depressed is they're getting told, hey, the measurements are good, but then they look around their communities and are like, well, things don't seem so good. My kids feel like they have to leave the city or the state in order to access the opportunities they need. Cost of housing and education and healthcare just keep on creeping up even as my wages stay the same, my job is insecure, my mall just closed, my factory just automated away a bunch of the jobs. So why are the measurements telling us we're doing great? If you had the right measurements in place, you would see we're in a wellness depression, we're in a mental health depression. And so number one is getting the measurements right. We have to make it so that we're greedy for improving our own lives, or we're greedy for making our kids' lives better, or our air and water cleaner. So that's number one, it's a measurement problem. And fundamentally, if you have the wrong measurements, you never make progress. So this is mission number one. Now mission number two, how do you actually adulterate the greed that has frankly pushed our country to this point, overrun our government, made it so that everything revolves around the almighty dollar in the society? Number one, you actually put more dollars in the hands of the American people very quickly and broadly in the form of a freedom dividend. Number two, you give us all 100 democracy dollars that we can only give to any candidates or campaigns. Because right now, the way that our government works is that it responds to the moneyed interests. So the answer is actually to make it so that the American people and the money are unified. You know what percentage of Americans right now donate to a political campaign? You guys are a political journalist. Don't worry about it. It's a tricky number. So you're experienced enough to know it's a very, very low number, even here in Iowa. Of course, here in Iowa, you're like, I don't need to donate because my vote is going to determine the course of history. It's true. We raise money in other parts of the country to spend it on you. We're certainly not going to ask you for money. Though if you do give money, fantastic. It's more like a vote. Just give us $5, doesn't matter. Anyway, fewer than 5% of Americans contribute to a political candidate or campaign. So if we gave 100 democracy dollars that you could give essentially for free to a candidate or campaign, what would that rate rise to? People are still pretty lazy, so it would not be 80% or 70%, but it might go from 5% to 40 or 50%. And even at 40 or 50%, you're looking at washing out the lobbyist cash in Washington by a factor of 4. This is just about the only thing we could do that would actually recapture our government to work for the people. And that is one of the reasons I love campaigning here in Iowa so much, because this is one of the only places in the country that actually gives us the power to flush the pipes of government of all of this lobbyist cash. If it doesn't happen in Iowa, it will never happen, because most of the rest of the country looks up and says there's nothing they can do. They are generally correct. There is not much they can do. But here in Iowa, you all can do something about it. So that's how we beat the greed, Carol. We actually unify the people and the resources. And we measure things correctly, or more correctly.
Seattle has done sort of a variation of the democracy dollars in a way, but they've seen this real influx of dark money. So it seems like
it's so interesting, right? It's like they start putting money in the hands of citizens, and then all of a sudden, like the corporate money's like, whoa, people money, let's freaking fight it. It's really interesting.
So it seems like it would have to be tied to overturning Citizens United as well to somehow block corporate money as well.
Yes, I am 100% for overturning Citizens United. We need to get the corporate money and the dark money out of politics to the extent that's possible. I would suggest, though, that corporate influence was real before Citizens United. And it's one reason why I think that this unification of people and the resources would be important even if we were to repeal Citizens United. It also requires a supermajority to repeal it or counteract it because of the nature of the ruling.
You just talked about kind of the power that the people of Iowa hold in this process. You were one of the first candidates to announce. You've been in Iowa quite a bit.
My 23rd time.
What have you learned from campaigning in Iowa?
I love campaigning in Iowa because you all are very smart and savvy and understand the power you have. People here in Iowa don't compare you to other candidates this cycle. They compare you to candidates from 12 years ago, or in some cases, 24 years ago. One thing I learned very specifically from a young man who said to me, he said his high school classmates have fentanyl patches on their arms and are already addicted to opiates. They would never actually seek help because they would be afraid of getting into trouble. What more can we do? And I heard this 18-year-old ask me this question. I thought, oh my gosh, like what could we do as a society that would help his classmates? And it was shocking to me, but not shocking because I understand the realities of what's happening in our communities, that an 18-year-old actually like reflecting on what the heck to do about his classmates being addicted to opiates in high school. So I dug into what other countries did when they were faced with an addiction crisis at this level. And some of them decriminalized opiates for personal use and made it so that if you were caught with them, they'd take the drugs away, but then they refer you to counseling and treatment instead of a prison cell. And they saw reductions in both use and overdose rates. And so it was that high schoolers' question here in Iowa that pushed me down that track. That's not the only thing I've learned from Iowans. I've learned a lot of things from Iowans. But that's one lesson that hit me particularly hard.
You were quoted last week as saying, "I'm pro-impeachment, but this is going to be a loser." If you were sitting in the House, how would you draw the line between constitutional responsibility and political implications?
If I was sitting in the House, I would vote with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats to say we should proceed with impeachment. You can't have your president bullying foreign leaders to sabotage your political rivals and withholding millions of dollars in aid to do so. I mean, at some point you have to try and enforce the Constitution. But if I were sitting in the House, I would also try to draw attention to the fact that Democrats recognize that we need to present a new positive vision for the country that Americans will get excited about, and that Donald Trump is a creature that thrives on attention. And so when we're talking about Donald Trump, Democrats are losing. That includes in the context of impeaching Donald Trump. You'd think, oh, when Americans see he's being impeached, this will be really bad for him. No, anything with Donald Trump in the sentence is good for Donald Trump. And so oxygen, particularly media oxygen, that is spent on the impeachment proceedings is time and attention that could be better spent establishing a positive vision of this country that would get Americans excited about actually solving the problems that got Donald Trump elected in the first place and moving us forward in 2020. If I were sitting in the House, could I make that happen? It'd be very, very difficult. Maybe I could get in front of a cable news camera and say these things, but the reality is impeachment may be a political loser, even if it is the right thing to do.
So the deadline to qualify for the next debate is a couple of days away, and you're really close, like a poll short. Last time I looked, do you think you'll make the stage?
My team told me that I qualified while we were sitting here. They just showed.
All right.
So I'm going to be on the debate stage on December 19th.
Okay. If you could write the debate rules, would they stay the same? Or
I would change them significantly. I think that 60 seconds or 75 seconds is the wrong time frame to try and convey a complicated set of ideas or policies to the American people. I think that having a dynamic that rewards food fights or conflict is something that the American people are tired of, where you can predict the dynamics on stage based upon where people are in the polling and what they signal to the press. And the format right now rewards that sort of thing. So if you were to make the change, what you'd want to do is do something that's actually a combination of both real-time and asynchronous, where I would suggest to folks that maybe this sort of format or conversation might be a better way for you to get to know various candidates and their point of view than a 60-second soundbite. Now, it might take a little bit more time, but I think the American people have the intelligence and patience and attention for that sort of thing. So what you can imagine is you can imagine 60-minute interview about a whole range of topics with people, and then you can imagine candidates being questioned about their response more in depth, and then refer to the longer Q&A so that if a viewer wants to see what someone thinks about healthcare or education, that they can actually dig in more deeply rather than have a dynamic where we're rewarded just for taking shots at each other with rehearsed attack lines.
When it comes to technology companies and social media, you've mentioned that maybe there's a role for the government in combating disinformation. Am I wrong to think that that's at best a really difficult needle to thread for the government to have a role in what could be construed as censorship?
It is difficult, but there's really no choice eventually. Because right now, if you have one, market-driven incentives that reward more sensationalist content on one hand, and then two, you have many bad actors, including foreign governments, who actually have this very high rooting interest in misinforming the American people and pitting us against each other. This is before deepfakes are widespread, where they could just show me saying something to you and it's indistinguishable from reality. So at what point do you say, well, this is going to lead us towards a really negative degree of polarization? I mean, you can argue we're already there. And so what do the counterweights look like? I'm friends with some of the folks in the tech companies, and at this point they're begging for government regulation, which is unheard of in that industry. They are not fans of government regulation, but right now they realize they're being put in untenable positions where they're making what should be public decisions because of the nature of their platforms and the nature of the information that they're spreading and sharing. So for the government to say, well, we can't make those decisions, we'll leave it to Facebook, I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. Like, if you believe in government at all, you would say, well, the government has to get in there and start establishing some kind of standards and protections. And if you ask the American people right now which set of risks they would rather pursue, the set of risks where we all devolve and don't even know what the facts are and can't even agree on, on like the parameters of a conversation, or that the government's going to screw up and somehow censor us all, even though at this point it'd be very difficult for the government to censor us all given the nature of the internet and the fact that, you know, like you could put information out there in a particular way. Like, I would argue that at a minimum you'd be trying to balance those interests. But the government just saying we can't figure it out is not a way to solve these problems. I understand the concerns, and I do think it's a very, very difficult balance to draw. But who would you rather make that decision, Congress or Facebook?
How do you think the American people would decide that? They don't have much faith in either Congress or Facebook.
This is true. So what I'm suggesting is that you have like a bipartisan commission. You have a whole set of journalists on this commission that maybe the American people even know and respect. And maybe, right? You could find a few, I'm sure, like a dozen, or, you know, and then they go out and say, look, like, we're on this panel. If it gets to a certain point, then we'll make a judgment, not get it right every time. But if you dig into my platform on the website, you'll see I have many pro-journalism proposals, because I think that local journalism is dying. Over 1,000 local newspapers have gone out of business because their classified revenue disappeared to Craigslist, and they used to rely upon local businesses advertising in their pages. And you know what happened? The local businesses went out of business. So if you're like the local paper, who the heck are you going to advertise for? So you die, and then that community gets less information, and studies have shown that then their voters become more polarized. Because if you don't have a basic set of facts in your community to agree on, you're just going to vote based upon whatever your party registration is, and democracy suffers. This is yet another symptom of the fact that the market is now the overwhelming force in American life, where if the market says local journalism shouldn't exist, then local journalism doesn't exist. And if our democracy suffers, well, the market didn't like it, so tough luck on us. At some point, you have to look up as a country, and it's really going to be up to Iowa to make this happen, to say, you know what, maybe we value things independent of the market. Maybe we think having a local paper is important for functional democracy in that community. And so then where do the resources come from? To me, the resources should come from the public sphere, the federal government, to come and say, look, we'll provide matching grants to local nonprofits or co-ops or people that are trying to bridge the gap in local journalism. You could headquarter it in local libraries that have bulletin boards that often serve as the skeleton of how people find information in that community. So this is an example of something where you could yell at me and say, like, government interfering with journalism, this is a terrible idea. And then you'd be like, well, do you just prefer local journalism doesn't exist? Like, is that the alternative that you prefer? So at some point you have to try and believe in government to start solving some of these problems.
Can you talk a little more about your relationship and your campaign's relationship with the media? It seems like from watching y'all on the internet, it's sort of a love-hate relationship. There are things that you or your campaign officials on Twitter have said against the media, and then as you know, the Yang Gang will click on anything that's about you and they think that'll have an impact on your coverage. Talk about how you see that relationship.
First, let me say I have a love-love relationship with the Des Moines Register. That's true. You all have been very, very fair to me, even generous from day one. I showed up here before just about anyone else. And I actually would say that my campaign would never have reached this point if not for the Des Moines Register, because you all were the first people to include me in a national poll. And just having my name in that poll actually ended up spurring other people to put me on their poll. That's how I got the 1%. That's how I got on the debate stage. That's how I've now raised tens of millions of dollars. And it was because the Des Moines Register treated me as a real candidate when I first showed up to the Iowa State Fair, not this year, but last year. So I've got a love-love relationship with you all. I've got a love-love relationship with anyone who I think is just a journalist trying to do their job. Now, and I'm not someone to complain about doing a very difficult job because, you know, it's like people like have hard jobs. The only part of the media that I would take issue with, and unfortunately there's a growing part of it, are the organizations that you could tell are very, very driven by particular financial and market incentives, and as a result of that, their coverage takes on a less than objective slant or angle. And we know who I'm talking about, really. And this, again, is a symptom of the fact that the market rules all, and that if you're a modern-day media company and you write a more sensationalistic or even antagonistic headline, you'll get more web traffic, whereas if you wrote something that was really neutral, then no one clicks on it, and then your editor yells at you, and then you lose your job. I mean, that's just, you know, where we are right now in journalism. So Des Moines Register, you all are awesome and above board. Most media outlets, I think, are doing a difficult job to the best of their ability. There are a few media outlets that you can tell they've got something of a market-driven agenda, and I do not think that's great for the American people.
Some of your statements on foreign policy sound almost isolationist. Quote, America has involved itself at too high a cost in foreign issues that don't concern us. And then you kind of point back to look at all of the Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck. Shouldn't we put our attention there? So how would you decide where to and how to invest American dollars abroad?
I am the furthest thing from an isolationist, let's put it that way. Like, I know that America benefits greatly from the international world order that we helped to establish. The question is, how do we maintain and preserve that world order? Do we do so by spending $650 billion on our military-industrial complex every year and sending our troops to fight in wars for 18 years that the American people aren't on board with, even though our Constitution says that it needs to be approved through Congress and from the American people? Or do we try and invest in our world order by being a steadfast partner and ally and build international consensus and even build a new international organization modeled after the WTO for data and technology, like the World Data Organization? Who's going to be proposing a World Data Organization if they're an isolationist? Like, nobody. The mechanism through which we operate, in my mind, should be much more consensus-driven, and we need to let our partners and allies know that we are not going to turn away from the world and that we're here to stay and that our commitments are good. That's the kind of investment we need to make. But that does not mean necessarily spending hundreds of billions of dollars on military expenditures that may or may not be making us any safer.
So could you kind of walk us through your criteria for committing troops?
I've got a three-part test to commit our armed forces in a foreign theater. Number one, there needs to be a clear, vital national interest at stake, or the potential to avert a humanitarian catastrophe. One of those two situations. Number two, there needs to be a clearly defined time frame where we can look our men and women in the eyes and say, you will be here for this long to accomplish the mission, and then you will be able to come home. And not some overly optimistic timeline that you dreamt up in the boardroom, and then when they get there, they'll find out that they can't actually accomplish the mission for years and years. Like an honest time frame where you say, we can get in, we can get this much done, we can get out. Number three, we need to have partners and allies that are willing to join us in the mission. If those three things apply, then I would consider sending our troops into harm's way.
Part of your climate change plan talks about nuclear energy, and there aren't many other candidates that do that. Have you got some other allies in the field who talk about nuclear energy these days?
You say allies in the field, you mean the other candidates? Well, I think nuclear energy gets a very bad rap politically, and I sense that some of my fellow candidates are actually more open to nuclear, but aren't really going around talking about it that much. The reality is we have a very, very energy-intensive economy and society. And if we're going to get serious about moving away from fossil fuels towards more renewable sources of energy like wind and solar and biofuels, nuclear should be on the table as part of the solution, particularly because some of the next generation nuclear reactors may be able to mitigate some of the things we don't like about our current nuclear reactors. So I think it needs to be on the table. We're in a crisis with climate change. We're decades behind the curve. And if you're in a crisis, you should not be foreclosing certain things that might help you. I think a lot of the information around nuclear is based upon decades old info that might not be as true today.
You talk a lot about the investments you want to make in renewable energy and a cap and dividend type of system to
Yep.
give you money to do it. How do you also, though, acknowledge that we really don't know what clean energy technologies are going to really pay out and be efficient a decade from now, 2 decades from now? How do you avoid the cylinders?
So first, there's like a bigger picture answer here. So when you go to the American people and you say, hey, we need to worry about climate change, there are a lot of us that say, yeah, we do. It's an existential threat. But then there are a lot of Americans who will look up and say, I can't pay my bills. I can't think about what's going to happen 5-10 years from now. Like, I'm worried about this month or next month. And when you go to those Americans and say, hey, we need to fight climate change, what they hear is my prices will go up, my life will be more inconvenient, there will be fewer jobs to go around. That's one reason why there's such tension around trying to move us towards renewables. Now, what I say to people is I say, look, right now we haven't internalized the cost of climate change. How much is climate change going to cost us? In dollar terms, trillions of dollars, and unfortunately, almost certainly thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of human lives. So if you have those costs baked into your cost of doing business, then all of a sudden, certain things that we're doing right now seem awfully expensive. And certain things that we're going to try and move us towards, like, save us money. So in that context, you don't expect every clean energy bet to pay off immediately in dollars and cents. And I'm an entrepreneur. I can tell you that if you're a professional venture investor, you would never go to a venture investor and say, hey, you need to make sure that 100% of your investments work out. Because they look at you and say, that's crazy. I know a majority of my investments are not going to work out. But the way that my fund succeeds is that the bets I do make that work out pay off so much that the missed bets are not that material. So if you were the government trying to move us towards a more renewable economy, you'd have to have some degree of patience and some degree of perspective that even the missteps in the context of a move this big are perfectly acceptable. And this is one of the problems with our politics right now, is that we live in a politics of fake perfection, where it's like, oh, if you said or did something immoral, then we're going to attack you for it, even if it was decades ago, or some other context. What your government policy made a mistake, we're then going to call it out and say, look, you spent millions of dollars on this thing and it didn't work out. What you'd ignore is like maybe they spent millions of dollars on this other thing and it paid off 10 times over, and so this one thing that they made a mistake on doesn't matter. That's the way businesses operate very, very often. Any business that operated the business of perfection would fail over time. And if anything, the government has historically been the place that invested in basic research that may or may not have immediate economic returns. That's how we got the internet. That's how we got Tesla. That's how we got a lot of the things that are helped move us forward in a significant way, that the government invested in basic research with unclear economics.
You've voiced general support for affirmative action, but you've also said that you resent it when Asian Americans are used as a lever in that debate. When does affirmative action make sense, and when does it go too far?
So Asian Americans being used as a lever are generally being used in a way to try and cast doubt on affirmative action. So those two things are actually complementary, where like I'm for affirmative action and I don't like when Asian Americans get used as a lever. I like affirmative action where it helps put people who are right now locked out of a particular institution or system a chance to participate and succeed. I look at the schools I've attended, many of which were significantly more diverse because of those policies than they would have been otherwise. Bigger picture, I think we're making way too much out of standardized tests in this country. Standardized tests are not a measurement of human worth or character or of your potential. And so if you had a school that was going around saying, hey, your SATs are X and we're just going to admit people based on that, to me, we should have a more holistic approach. So I think affirmative action certainly has a place to try and include people that would otherwise be left out, and in some cases helping to address historic imbalances that certain communities have experienced.
You'd obviously be the first Asian American president. What ways do you think that would make a difference in your presidency?
I'm very proud of being the first Asian American man to run for president as a Democrat. I think one of the things I bring to the table is that Americans sense that I'm not particularly ideological, that I just want to move us forward, and I'm very information and data driven. I think that's going to give me the ability to get things done in Washington that other people might not, because they might have a stronger ideological stake in a particular approach to a problem. I think I might be able to help us bridge the relationship with China in a way that helps us address climate change and the competition in artificial intelligence that we're facing. Things that I think are going to be very important to us moving forward. And I think that my presidency could help restore a sense of what's possible in this country, where my father grew up on a peanut farm with no floor in Asia, and his son is running for president, and in this hypothetical, obviously I am president. So one of the signals that sends to the rest of the world is that if you are someone who's looking to build a life or a career or start a family, that America should be a place that you want to do it. This is a competition that we historically have won, where if you are a bright, ambitious person in Asia or Europe or Africa or Latin America, you tried to come to the United States. And we've benefited from that tremendously. My father immigrated here as a graduate student in physics and generated 69 US patents for GE and IBM, which I think was a big net win for this country. And so we have to become a magnet for that kind of human capital again, and I believe that my presidency could help us move in that direction very, very quickly.
You frequently joke about being the Asian guy that does math, or that you know lots of doctors. Do you worry about reinforcing stereotypes, or that you'll go too far in some of that self-deprecation?
I think Americans recognize a joke when they hear it, and I think Americans are smart enough to know that if you're looking at a community of millions of different people, that we're a very diverse community, and that certainly that there's no one individual whose experience is representative of millions of Americans, and that if anything, by making light of these stereotypes, they're being brought into a public discussion that makes people realize how ridiculous it is to apply that sort of stereotype to a group of millions.
Can you tell us about the young man who sort of brought to better focus the opioid issues? Can you think of a time, not necessarily from the campaign, where your mind has been changed on an issue as a result of new information you learned?
Oh yeah, I changed my mind based on new information quite regularly. One thing was around the approach to the tech companies, where seeing that Twitter said no more political ads and then Facebook hemmed and hawed, I mean, it was obvious that if Facebook were making more money based upon verifying the truth of political ads versus just allowing them all, then they'd take the other tack. Like, this is another example of a company that's just doing what's best for its bottom line, as opposed to any kind of principled rationale. And so I saw that and I said, wow, good for Twitter, bad for Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg really needs to try and mature as quickly as possible as a leader to keep it so that Americans, frankly, don't mistrust Facebook in fundamental ways. So that was a new piece of information that came up in real time.
So does that mean you redirected your campaign to stop advertising on Facebook?
Well, I directed my campaign to say, in no uncertain terms, Facebook should be taking responsibility for the truth of its political ads, and I directed my campaign to, make sure that we're never producing anything that's false. But right now, Facebook is a way that campaigns like ours reach voters, and so we're going to keep doing it as long as it's effective.
You just spoke very eloquently just now about your father and all the ways that our nation has benefited from his presence. Going forward, looking at reforming legal immigration, how do you balance kind of the historical family immigration with wanting to perhaps entice more higher skilled workers?
I don't think it's an either or, and one of the examples I use is that one of the founders of Google came in on a family visa. That's kind of an enormous win. So you can adopt an approach where we staple a green card to the diploma of any international student who studies here in this country, which we should do. Why on earth are we educating someone and then sending them back to compete against us? And I've had conversations with students here in Iowa who have said to me, I want to stay, and they're kicking me out. And I say that does not make much sense. But stapling a green card to that person's diploma does not mean you necessarily need to abandon the family reunification visas or any of those approaches. Other developed countries have taken a tack where you can do multiple things with your approach to immigration. I don't think it's either or myself.
We're just about at time. Any more questions from the table? I'll throw a general one. How will America be different in 2024 at the end of your first term?
Everyone will know that I became president in large part on the promise of a freedom dividend that puts the benefits of the 21st century into our hands. And here in Iowa, you can see it. 30% of your stores and malls are closing because Amazon's sucking up all this value and they're paying zero in taxes. By 2024, every American will be a shareholder and owner in the gains of the 21st century economy. This $1,000 a month in your hands will make our families stronger, more whole, healthier, mentally healthier. It will revitalize many Main Street businesses and communities that right now are on the verge of shutting down. And after I'm president, Democrats and progressives will be so thrilled to have beaten Donald Trump, they'll say, yes, let's get this dividend across the finish line into people's hands. But here's the great thing. Conservatives and Republicans will look up and say, wait a minute, do I dislike the dividend? The one state that's had a dividend for almost 40 years, Alaska, is a deep red conservative state, and it was passed by a Republican governor. What they're doing with oil in Alaska, we can do with technology for the entire country. And conservatives don't hate economic freedom in the hands of Americans. They hate a giant bureaucracy making everyone's decisions. So by 2024, the American people will be experiencing the benefits of this dividend that's improving our way of life. And it will get the boot off of our throats. It will reduce the political polarization. And people will be coming together saying, wow, we actually can solve the big problems. What's next?
Thank you, Mr. Yang. And please come back to DesMoinesRegister.com for all the coverage of the Iowa caucus.
Hey guys. Oh my gosh. I am exhausted. But yeah, I know that why you guys are here. One of you guys actually asked me to do a live stream because you wanted to talk about this Monmouth poll. Wait, hold on. I want to make sure that you guys can actually hear and see me. Let me know if you guys can hear and see me. Type 1. I'm going to first start with some, general updates. So let me see here. Okay, great. Thank you. Need to do that. Wait a second. Hold on. Crap, you guys, I think I might need to come back. I can't share my screen. No, here we go. All right. So, like I always say, I know it got my hopes up too, but we'll talk about the polls. All right. So we're at 484K. Look, I know that this recent news is a bit demoralizing. I'm not going to lie. It's